The autumn of 1902 settled over Ashmore Hill, less with a gentle cascade of color and more with a heavy, damp shroud. The town was a patchwork of stark Victorian architecture and muddy, unpaved streets, its prosperity clinging to the last vestiges of a fading mining boom. Above it all, on a slight rise overlooking the settlement, stood the stone house, a structure locally known as the Sallie house, not for any haunting, but for the family that had lived and died within its impenetrable granite walls. Sheriff Thomas O'Connell, a man whose 45 years had etched worry lines deeper than the Grand Canyon, stood at the foot of the drive, the wind whipping the collar of his heavy wool coat. The sky was the color of old pewter, threatening rain that would turn the local clay to treacherous sludge. His young deputy, Elias Thorne, shifted nervously beside him, kicking at a loose stone. "You smell that, Elias?" O'Connell's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. Elias sniffed the air, which carried the crisp scent of dying leaves and a faint metallic tang. "Just the weather turning, Sheriff. And maybe the old privy." O'Connell shook his head, his gaze fixed on the grim facade of the house. "No, that's the smell of things sealed off, of a life suddenly stopped. 3 days ago, the Sallie family, wealthy industrialist Arthur Sallie, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Thomas Jr. and 6-year-old Clara, had been found dead inside. Not from fire, not from a break-in, but from something far more disturbing. A shared, inexplicable tragedy. The initial report was vague, hinting at an unnatural stasis and a disturbing absence of struggle. They pushed open the heavy oak door. The interior was a mausoleum of wealth and silence. The air inside was still and cold, a different kind of cold than the autumn air, a cold that seemed to come from the very marrow of the house. The living room was impeccable, a testament to Eleanor Sallie's fastidious nature. A needlepoint hoop rested on a side table, the needle still threaded. The newspaper, dated 3 days prior, lay folded on an armchair. The only anomaly, the reason O'Connell felt that chilling smell of things sealed off, was the scene in the parlor. The bodies had been removed, but the outlines remained, chalk marks on the expensive Persian rug. Arthur, seated in his favorite leather chair. Eleanor, positioned stiffly on a settee, and the 2 children lying side by side, perfectly aligned, on the floor nearby. The official cause of death, pending the full medical report, was a swift, overwhelming systemic failure, but the circumstances screamed something else. "Look at this, Sheriff," Elias whispered, pointing to a small wooden dollhouse in the corner, a miniature replica of the stone house itself. A detail O'Connell had missed in the initial chaos. The dollhouse was open, revealing its miniature interior. In the tiny parlor, 4 miniature figures, Arthur, Eleanor, Thomas Jr., and Clara, were arranged in the exact same positions as the bodies on the rug. "Mrs. Sallie was known for her craft work," O'Connell murmured, his hand hovering over the dollhouse. "She made things for the children." "But this," Elias trailed off, "it looks like a staged diorama. Did someone set this up after they died to mock it?" "Or before," O'Connell countered, his eyes narrowing. "It suggests planning, Elias. A cruel, deliberate, premeditated act, or perhaps a warning." They moved into the kitchen. Here the normalcy was suffocating. Half-eaten plates of breakfast, oatmeal and toast, sat on the mahogany table, 2 empty coffee cups, a kettle on the stove, still slightly warm to the touch. No sign of poison in the initial sweep, but the medical examiner will confirm, O'Connell said, running a gloved finger over the rim of a cup. But if it was a quick poison, why the elaborate staging in the parlor, and why was the death so peaceful? They ascended the wide, creaking staircase. The banister felt unnaturally cold. In the children's room, Thomas Jr.'s desk held a half-finished arithmetic problem, the ink still slightly wet, as if he had only just stood up to stretch. Clara's bed was unmade, a single plush teddy bear lying on the pillow. "Sheriff," Elias called from the master bedroom, his voice tight. "You need to see this." O'Connell found Elias standing by a heavy, bolted safe recessed into the wall. The safe was wide open. Inside, a few ledgers and papers were scattered, but the prominent space was empty. "What was kept here?" O'Connell asked, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. Arthur Sallie's journal, for one, and a collection of letters from his business partners. The things that detailed the last few months of his dealings. The ones that had the town talking. Elias picked up a ledger. "Looks like everything financial is still here, but the personal, the incriminating, that's gone." O'Connell walked to the window, looking out over the hill toward the town. Ashmore Hill seemed to be holding its breath. He wasn't looking at a simple tragedy. He was looking at a meticulously crafted illusion. A crime scene staged to look like a spontaneous, peaceful family end, executed to cover something far darker and more human. The only sound in the dead quiet of the house was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock in the hallway, the indifferent measure of time moving on while the family's secrets lay exposed. "This wasn't a haunting, Elias," O'Connell stated, the words heavy. "This was a message. And the message is, don't look too closely, but we will. We have to figure out what Arthur Sallie was hiding and who wanted it buried with his family." He turned back to the room, the scent of stale air and something metallic. The faint scent of blood, perhaps, or merely the lingering essence of fear, clinging to his senses. If you're hooked by this dark mystery and want to see how Sheriff O'Connell uncovers the chilling human truth behind this tragedy, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't miss the next chapter, where we delve into Arthur Sallie's controversial business dealings and the long list of people who might have wanted him silenced. Sheriff O'Connell and Deputy Thorne spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously cataloging the remaining items in the open safe. The ledgers they found were dense, detailing Arthur Sallie's financial transactions over the last 5 years. They weren't messy, they were too precise, too sterile. "Arthur Sallie wasn't just an industrialist, Elias," O'Connell muttered, flipping through a page detailing massive recent debt acquisitions. "He was a gambler. He was leveraging the entire future of Ashmore Hill's mining infrastructure on ventures nobody here fully understood. The Ashmore Consolidation Project," Elias read from a headline in a tucked-away newspaper clipping. "Everyone called it a boom, said he was going to make the town richer than ever." "Everyone wanted to believe it," O'Connell countered, his gaze distant. "But the figures here tell a different story. Massive outflows, unsecured loans, and look at this, a series of payments to 3 specific small properties, all outside the county, all labeled only with initials." He tapped the names, J.H., V.M., and A.K. The metallic tang in the air of the house, which O'Connell had initially dismissed as the stale air of a sealed space, now felt like a faint, lingering reminder of the swift, systemic end the family had met. It spoke of a sudden, forced cessation, not a natural passing. The parlor, with its grim dollhouse tableau, felt less like a stage for death and more like an elaborate frame for the removal of the personal, damning documents, specifically Sallie's journal and letters. The first person O'Connell sought was Mrs. Abigail Kent, the town's most prominent seamstress, and incidentally, the widow of one of Sallie's closest, albeit failed, business partners. Her parlor was the antithesis of the Sallie house, warm, cluttered, and smelling of lavender and cotton. Abigail, a woman whose face was softened by perpetual worry lines, offered them weak tea. "Arthur was ambitious," she said, carefully folding a piece of lace. "After my Harold passed, the pneumonia, you see, Arthur made a show of helping me. Paid off Harold's small debts, but he never let me forget it." "The nature of his help, Mrs. Kent," O'Connell pressed gently. "Did he ask for anything in return? Did he speak of any anxieties, any specific people he feared?" Abigail's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. He had meetings, late ones, always with men from the city, suits and polished shoes that never belonged on our dusty roads. He was afraid of them, Thomas. Said they held all the markers. One time, just a month ago, he came to the shop frantic. He was looking for Eleanor. He said, "They're not just interested in the money anymore, Abigail. They're interested in us." "Us?" Elias interjected. "The family. His legacy. His name." Abigail clarified, her eyes welling up. He was talking about protecting the children. He was arranging things. He mentioned selling the stone house and moving east quickly. He said he had to buy back the silence, but he was running out of time. O'Connell pulled out the ledger and pointed to the initials AK and the substantial recent payment. "Was this his way of buying silence from you, Mrs. Kent?" Abigail stiffened, her reserve hardening. "That was for the old debt, Sheriff. The one he insisted on carrying from Harold's failed mine. He said it was the only clean one left on the books. Her denial was too swift, too practiced. The debt was small, the payment was large. It was a payoff." Leaving Abigail's house, O'Connell instructed Elias to wire the city to run the 3 sets of initials. They needed to know who JH and VM were and why Sallie was paying them to stay quiet. "She's hiding something, Sheriff," Elias observed as they walked past the bakery, the scent of fresh bread battling the autumn damp. "She protected his name even after his death. She protected her own security, Elias. She's terrified of what he was involved in. Sallie House wasn't just a place where a family died. It was a nexus of dangerous secrets, and someone cleared the primary evidence." O'Connell's mind returned to the parlor, the staged perfection, the dollhouse. It was a signature of control, a deliberate, chilling aesthetic applied to a brutal crime. If the journal and letters contained explosive information about his financial dealings and the powerful men he was indebted to, then the crime wasn't personal, it was corporate. A contract executed with brutal efficiency and a theatrical flourish meant to confuse the initial investigation. Back at the station, the wire operator handed O'Connell the preliminary response. JH and VM were not corporate contacts. They were 2 other women in neighboring counties, Josephine Hayes and Victoria Miller. Both were widows of minor partners who had recently met with accidental deaths related to mining collapses or travel mishaps. Both had received large, quiet settlements from Arthur Sallie in the last 6 months. O'Connell slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing in the small office. 3 widows, 3 payoffs, 3 recent deaths. Arthur Sallie wasn't just protecting his family, he was protecting a criminal enterprise. And when he decided to pull out, the people who controlled him used the deaths of the other 2 families as a grim template. He stared at the telegram. The pattern was clear. The deaths were designed to look like a final, desperate act of a compromised man, a murder-suicide or a shared sudden illness to stop the investigation before it started. The staged scene was a cruel mockery of the family's final moments, but the true intent was the smooth, untraceable removal of the damning evidence. "Elias," O'Connell said, pulling on his coat, "get the horses ready. We're going to see Mrs. Hayes." If Sallie was paying these women, he wasn't paying them for silence about the deaths. He was paying them for silence about what caused them. And whatever it was, it killed her husband, it killed his partner, and it just killed the Sallie family. The wind howled outside, a desolate sound that seemed to carry the voices the title had alluded to. Not of ghosts, but of secrets, buried and desperate to be heard. The investigation was no longer about a mysterious death. It was about exposing a cycle of calculated murder and industrial corruption that had turned the Sallie house into a sterile, perfect grave. Do you appreciate how this deepens the mystery and fear without using any supernatural elements? If you're completely invested in the chilling reality of this conspiracy and want to follow Sheriff O'Connell as he risks everything to expose the truth, you must subscribe to the channel now. The plot thickens with every chapter. Now, let's continue with Chapter 3. The journey to Josephine Hayes's farm in the next county was arduous, the autumn rains having finally arrived and turned the narrow dirt roads into treacherous, muddy trenches. O'Connell and Thorne rode in tense silence, the weight of the new information pressing down on them. 3 separate deaths, all connected to Sallie's recent, desperate transactions, pointed to a powerful, organized force. Josephine Hayes was younger than O'Connell expected, her face a mask of grief and recent fear. She lived in a modest farmhouse that was struggling against the encroaching poverty of the rural mining sector. She was instantly defensive, her arms crossed tight across her chest. "I have nothing to say about Arthur, Sallie," she said, not inviting them inside. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Mrs. Hayes," O'Connell began, his voice calm but firm. "Your husband, David, died in a tunnel collapse 3 months ago. Sallie gave you a substantial sum of money shortly after. Not an insurance payout, but a personal settlement. We need to know why." Josephine's eyes darted nervously toward a nearby window, then quickly back to the sheriff. He was a kind man. He felt responsible. David worked on the Ashmore project site briefly. He felt responsible, or he was paying you to keep quiet about a specific detail of the collapse, O'Connell pressed, stepping closer. "We know about Victoria Miller, too. Her husband, killed in a train accident after a meeting with Sallie. These are not coincidences, Mrs. Hayes. These are steps in a sequence." The mention of Victoria Miller broke Josephine's composure. Her chin began to tremble. "He promised they were safe," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Arthur promised. He said if I just signed the papers, the men from the city would leave me alone. He was terrified. He said they were using the project to cover up something much dirtier." "What was it, Josephine? What was the dirty thing?" She finally broke, leaning against the doorframe, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "The dust, the air quality in the new shafts. David found it. The Ashmore project wasn't just about mining new ore. It was about opening old, condemned shafts full of pollutants and contaminants that Sallie was supposed to clean up years ago. But he didn't. He was running a fraudulent operation, exposing the workers to deadly substances to cut costs and meet impossible deadlines. The metallic tang O'Connell had smelled in the Sallie house, the systemic failure in the family's bodies, flashed through his mind. The contaminants. What specifically? Did David describe it? Something chemical, something that affects the lungs first, then the entire body. David got sick fast. They called it miner's cough, but it wasn't. It was poison. Sallie knew. He tried to seal the knowledge, and he paid David's death off as an accident to avoid a massive lawsuit and criminal charges. The realization hit O'Connell with the force of a physical blow. The Sallie family didn't die from a magical curse or a random event. They died from the very poison Arthur Sallie had been inflicting on his workers to enrich himself. They were victims of his own corporate corruption, likely executed by the powerful partners who feared Sallie was about to expose their shared secret to save himself. "The men from the city," O'Connell said, turning to Elias. "They didn't just want the money. They wanted the silence. And when Sallie started paying off the widows, they knew he was panicking and preparing to talk." Josephine straightened, wiping her face fiercely. Arthur was going to confess. He sent Eleanor a letter saying he was going to expose the whole operation, even if it ruined him. He said he couldn't live with the blood on his hands anymore. I think that's what they were looking for when they took his journal. That letter to Eleanor. The Stonehouse parlor scene took on a new horrifying layer of meaning. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a punishment, a calculated irony. The perpetrator used the very poison Sallie had used on his workers to erase his entire life, including his attempt at redemption. O'Connell felt a surge of cold dread. The sophistication of the crime, the way it mimicked a sudden natural death, the meticulous removal of specific evidence. This was not local thugs. This was organized, protected, and terrifyingly efficient. "We need to find Victoria Miller immediately," O'Connell instructed Thorne. "And we need to get back to Ashmore Hill." If Sallie was planning to confess, he might have used an old private hiding spot to safeguard a copy of that letter or his confession, something they missed in the safe. As they remounted their horses, the rain fell harder, washing the grime from the fields but failing to cleanse the town of the sickness that Arthur Sallie had introduced. The echoes of Ashmore Hill were not the moans of the dead, but the choking cough of the dying workers and the silence of the murdered family. The terror was no longer supernatural. It was the chilling, stark reality of human depravity and the cost of greed. Back in Ashmore Hill, the stone house felt less like a crime scene and more like a sealed coffin holding the town's darkest secret. O'Connell knew the confession, if it existed, would not be in a predictable place. It needed to be somewhere personal, somewhere Eleanor Sallie would have found it if Arthur had disappeared, but invisible to a professional cleaner. They focused their search on the private areas of the house. The library, Arthur's study, the master bedroom, all were checked again, this time for loose floorboards, false backs in bookcases, or discreetly hollowed-out furniture. The silence of the house was punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of the hallway clock and the squeak of old floorboards under their boots. In Arthur's massive, ornate desk, O'Connell found a hidden compartment beneath the inkwell stand, revealed by a spring mechanism disguised as a carved leaf. Inside, it was empty, coated with a fine layer of dust. The perpetrator had anticipated a common hiding spot. "They were thorough, Elias," O'Connell sighed, closing the compartment. "They knew his habits. If he was confessing to Eleanor, maybe he left it with her," Elias suggested, standing by Eleanor Sallie's dressing table in the master bedroom. Eleanor's side of the room was softer, filled with delicate lace and small porcelain figurines. It was in stark contrast to Arthur's heavy utilitarian furniture. O'Connell examined her dressing table. It was secured to the wall, heavy and stable. He ran his hand under the drawers, checking for a key taped underneath, a loose panel, anything, nothing. Then his gaze fell on a peculiar piece of furniture in the corner, a large, antique chest used for storing blankets and linens placed directly against the chimney breast. The chest was heavier than it should have been when they tried to move it. "Help me with this, Elias." With a grunt, they pulled the chest away from the wall. The rough, unplastered brick was visible. The space where the chest had sat was notably darker, cleaner. But O'Connell's eyes weren't drawn to the discoloration. They were drawn to a slight irregularity in the masonry. A single brick near the floor seemed fractionally out of alignment. O'Connell knelt, pulling a small, thin knife from his kit. He carefully scraped away the old mortar around the brick. It was a dummy, a removable cover. He worked it loose, and it came free with a slight, grating sound. The cavity behind the brick was small, lined with dry cloth. Inside, nestled deep, was a tightly rolled, wax-sealed paper. It was the missing confession. O'Connell carefully broke the seal, the heavy paper crinkling in his gloved hands. It was written in Arthur Sallie's meticulous script, dated 2 days before his death. The letter was a damning testament. It confirmed everything Josephine Hayes had said and more. Arthur detailed the full extent of the environmental fraud. The toxic chemicals being illegally dumped into the old, unused mine shafts, the very shafts that ran beneath the town's water table to avoid disposal costs. The contaminants were designed to be slow-acting, affecting the workers over months, masking the cause of death as a respiratory illness. He named the 3 major investors from the city who had orchestrated the entire scheme, using Ashmore Hill as their corporate dumping ground. "Eleanor, my darling, I can no longer live with this terror. The sickness is in the ground, and it is in me. I killed David Hayes. I killed Victoria Miller's husband. I sent those men to their graves, and for what? Money that is now worthless. These men, Herrick, Vance, and Alderson, they are monsters. They have threatened the children. They said if I expose them, they will take everything from us, slowly, painfully. But I cannot let this poison continue. I have made copies of the full ledger and sent them to a solicitor in the capital. This confession is for you, in case they come for me before I can make amends. I love you, and I pray you forgive my sins. They are coming, Eleanor. The cold hand of my greed has finally reached my family. O'Connell's heart hammered against his ribs. Herrick, Vance, and Alderson, the real masters of Ashmore Hill. These were not mere financiers. They were criminal masterminds who used environmental homicide as a business strategy. The confession was the key, the final, crucial piece of evidence that the killers had missed. He looked at the empty dollhouse in the parlor downstairs. The cold hand of my greed, Arthur's own words. The killer had not just staged the scene. They had killed the Sallies using the very chemical poison Arthur had employed on his workers. A poetic, terrifying act of justice and ultimate control, ensuring that the death looked like a peaceful, shared illness, a systemic failure matching the effects of the toxin. The lack of struggle, the calm poses. It was the effect of the chemical agent. Elias, O'Connell said, his voice hard with resolve. We've got the names. We have the motive, the method, and the connection. The people who killed the Sallies are now actively operating in Ashmore Hill. They came here for the letter, and they're still here, covering their tracks. They had the truth, but possessing it made them targets. The danger had escalated from a mysterious crime to a direct confrontation with a powerful criminal syndicate willing to murder entire families to protect their fortunes. The air in the stone house, now thick with the weight of the confession, felt not cold, but utterly suffocating. They were stepping into the middle of a war they could not afford to lose. The following day, O'Connell initiated the most discreet phase of the investigation. He couldn't trust the local telegraph office or even the county prosecutor. Herrick, Vance, and Alderson had likely leveraged their wealth to buy influence far beyond the city limits. The immediate priority was finding the solicitor Arthur Sallie mentioned, the only other person with a copy of the ledger. O'Connell sent Elias on a grueling all-night ride to the state capitol with a handwritten, coded message to a trusted former colleague in the state police, detailing the names and the environmental fraud. Elias was to deliver the confession and the ledger notes in person, bypassing all local authorities until state intervention could be secured. Alone in his small, dusty office, O'Connell reviewed the local papers, searching for any recent presence of the three men. Herrick, Vance, and Alderson, the trio were known to the business world, but rarely seen in Ashmore Hill, preferring to manage their assets remotely. Then, a small notice in the society pages caught his eye. Mr. V. Alderson and his associate, Mr. J. Herrick, are currently enjoying a quiet stay at the Ashmore Inn, attending to local investment restructuring over the next week. They hadn't left. They were here, in Ashmore Hill, consolidating the assets and ensuring the cover-up was complete. The timing was too perfect. They arrived right as the Sallie investigation was wrapping up with the initial natural death findings. They were the cleanup crew, and their stay was a brazen display of confidence. O'Connell decided to pay them a visit, not as the investigating sheriff, but as the small-town official ready to close the file. He needed to assess them, to see the face of the corruption that had poisoned his town. The Ashmore Inn was the town's jewel, a 3-story testament to the short-lived boom. The lobby was hushed, dominated by expensive oak paneling and the scent of fine cigar smoke. O'Connell was directed to a private sitting room. James Herrick was a rail-thin man with a meticulously trimmed mustache and eyes that held the chilling emptiness of a predator. Vance Alderson was the opposite, hulking, slow-moving, with hands that seemed too large for the teacup he held. Both wore tailored suits that looked grossly out of place in the dusty inn. "Sheriff O'Connell," Herrick said smoothly, standing to offer a handshake that was surprisingly limp. "A tragedy, the Sallie family. We were deeply saddened. Arthur was an associate, a brilliant but troubled man. Troubled, Mr. Herrick? O'Connell kept his expression neutral. In what way? Financially, of course. The pressures of the consolidation project were immense. He was reckless. We were, unfortunately, forced to step in to protect our own interests. He had become erratic in his decision-making. Erratic enough to stage his family's death and disappear? O'Connell probed, watching their faces closely. Alderson let out a low, humorless chuckle. Such a dramatic suggestion, Sheriff. The medical examiner was clear. Systemic failure. A tragic, shared illness. We are merely here to ensure the transition of the company assets is seamless for the town's sake. Speaking of seamless, you two arrived shortly after the incident. Convenient timing. Herrick smiled, a cold, unnatural lift of the corner of his mouth. Effective management, Sheriff. We anticipate needs. We were concerned about the rumors, unpleasant speculations. It's best for a small community to find peace quickly. The arrogance was staggering. They were not only admitting they were here to control the narrative, they were practically boasting about their efficiency. O'Connell shifted his weight, leaning forward slightly. Arthur Sallie was preparing to sell the stone house and move. He was making settlements with 3 local women, Josephine Hayes, Victoria Miller, and Abigail Kent, widows of former partners, men who died under suspicious circumstances connected to the Ashmore project. The air in the room instantly chilled. Alderson's large hands tightened on the teacup, his knuckles white. Herrick's smooth facade cracked, the smile vanishing. Those matters were merely confidential severance payouts, Herrick said, the smoothness gone, replaced by a razor-sharp edge. And they are irrelevant to the Sallie family tragedy, Sheriff. If you persist in pursuing these wild, speculative theories, you will find your professional life severely complicated. Ashmore Hill is a peaceful place. Don't disturb its quiet for the sake of a dead, reckless man. It was a clear, chilling threat. They knew O'Connell had found the pattern. They were testing the boundary, checking if he had the evidence. I am merely investigating the death of 4 citizens, Mr. Herrick. My duty is to the living and the dead, O'Connell replied, standing to leave. He caught Herrick's eye. And the death in the Sallie house was not peaceful. It was a calculated, controlled execution. You missed one thing, gentlemen. Arthur Sallie was a coward, but he wasn't silent. He walked out, the silence of the inn lobby suddenly feeling like the deep, crushing pressure of a mine shaft. He had rattled them, but now he had confirmed they were the killers, and they knew he was closing in. The danger had moved from a remote threat to an immediate, physical presence in the town. He was alone, and he had to trust that Elias and the confession were already far away, racing against the tightening noose of the conspirators. O'Connell retreated to the one place in town that still felt entirely his own, the local tavern, the Rusty Pick. He sat in a shadowed corner, nursing a lukewarm coffee, the confession tucked securely into the inner pocket of his coat. He was no longer just a sheriff. He was a custodian of a dangerous truth. The atmosphere in the town was noticeably changing. The initial shock over the Sallie deaths had curdled into an undercurrent of nervousness. People talked in lowered voices, glancing toward the Ashmore Inn where Herrick and Alderson resided like kings. The fear was palpable, not of ghosts, but of the sudden, brutal power of men who operated beyond the law. O'Connell knew he couldn't act alone, not against a syndicate this powerful. He needed proof that could stand up in court, beyond the confession which the defense would easily discredit as the ramblings of a suicidal, disgraced man. He needed the physical evidence of the poison. The logical person to turn to was the town's doctor and medical examiner, Dr. Silas Vance, no relation to the criminal Vance. Dr. Vance was a respected man, meticulous in his work, but deeply cautious. O'Connell visited the clinic after hours, the scent of antiseptic strong in the deserted hallways. Dr. Vance was packing up for the evening, his face drawn. "Thomas, you look like you haven't slept in a week," Vance said, rubbing his tired eyes. "I haven't, Silas. I found something. Something that changes everything about the Sallie deaths." O'Connell laid the confession on the desk. Vance read the letter, his face losing color with every line. "My God, Thomas. The environmental contamination, the slow poison." Vance looked up, his eyes wide with horror. If this is true, then the systemic failure wasn't natural. It was an induced failure, designed to look like a shared sudden illness. Exactly. The chemical agent. "You wrote that their end was disturbingly peaceful, with no signs of external trauma or internal struggle. That is the signature of the poison Arthur Sallie used on his workers. The same one Herrick and Alderson used on him and his family." Vance slumped into his chair. "I sent the samples to the state lab in the city. They'll be back next week. But even if I find traces of a contaminant, Thomas, the defense will argue it's just from the poor air quality in the town. They'll bury us in paperwork. We need to know the specific poison, Silas, the one Arthur was using on the workers, the one the killers used on the family. We need the original source." Vance's mind raced, ticking through his knowledge of local industries and chemistry. The old shafts. They were used for nickel and sulfur processing before the iron boom. There were toxins involved, yes, heavy metals, but Arthur's ledger mentions something that works fast, systemic failure, not slow lung decay. He calls it the sickness in the ground, O'Connell reminded him. Vance stood up abruptly, pulling a set of heavy keys from his pocket. "I need to look at my initial samples again. I took blood and tissue, preserved them, thank God. But I also took a sample of the air from the Stonehouse parlor on that first day, just out of professional curiosity. The ambient atmosphere. They went down to the sterile quiet of the morgue. Under the harsh electric light, Vance examined the sealed vial of air. He performed a quick, crude chemical test in his small lab, a test designed for simple detection of heavy compounds. He dropped the test strip into the vial. It turned a sickly, deep green. "Barium," Vance breathed out, his voice a tight whisper of terror. "Barium compounds. Highly soluble, virtually tasteless, and a fast-acting systemic poison. It causes immediate muscle paralysis, followed by cardiac arrest. The symptoms match the peaceful end perfectly. It's what they use in some specialized drilling operations far from here. Why would it be in the air of the Sallie house parlor? Because the killer left it there. A cruel signature, a last breath of the toxin that Arthur brought into the ground," O'Connell concluded, his mind piecing the puzzle together. "They administered it orally, likely through the coffee at breakfast, then ensured the parlor was still saturated with it to mess with the initial assessment." Vance now looked beyond fear to a grim certainty. "The source, Thomas. If they brought barium compounds here, they had to have a local storage place for the poison. It would be impossible to bring enough into the house without trace. They kept it nearby." The old, condemned mine shafts, O'Connell realized. Arthur was dumping chemicals there. The killers used his own illegal storage as their source. It's the perfect, untraceable supply chain. The investigation now had a clear objective. Find the specific mine shaft, the architect of the family's terror, where the industrial poison was stored. The pressure was immense. If Herrick and Alderson learned O'Connell had the barium evidence, his life, and the evidence Elias was carrying, would be forfeit. The terror was escalating into a direct, desperate race against time. O'Connell knew that trying to get an official search warrant for the mine shafts would tip his hand, giving Herrick and Alderson enough time to disappear or clean out the evidence. He had to be surgical and silent. He and Dr. Vance spent the early hours of the morning poring over old, hand-drawn maps of the Ashmore Consolidated Mine System. The map was a labyrinth of active tunnels, abandoned veins, and sealed-off shafts. According to Arthur Sallie's ledgers, The largest and most frequent illegal dumping runs were made late at night, involving only a handful of trusted and well-paid crewmen. Arthur's journal mentioned Shaft 4, over by the old reservoir, Vance said, tracing a finger over a dark, isolated section of the map. It was decommissioned 2 decades ago. The bedrock around it is unstable, perfect for hiding something deep. A place where nobody would look and nobody would hear, O'Connell agreed. And if they're storing the bulk poison there, the air down there would be toxic, deadly. The weather, as if mirroring the town's descent into corruption, had turned violently cold. A harsh wind whipped through the streets, carrying a mix of freezing rain and sleet. They approached Shaft 4 in the dead of the Ashmore Hill night. The site was remote, accessible only by a narrow, muddy track. The old head frame stood silhouetted against the dark sky, a desolate, skeletal monument to a dead industry. As they neared the shaft entrance, O'Connell noticed a faint, almost imperceptible detail. The ground around the sealed entrance wasn't uniformly covered in the mud and pine needles of the surrounding forest. There were recent faint tracks, tire marks from a heavy vehicle recently obscured by the rain. Someone was here recently, Silas. Probably after the Sallies were killed, cleaning up loose ends. O'Connell whispered, drawing his revolver. The shaft entrance was covered by a heavy, rusted steel door, secured with a thick chain and a robust padlock. The lock was new. The old lock was probably too corroded, Vance noted quietly. They replaced it to make it look sealed. But this new lock, he shined his lantern on it, is too clean, too well maintained. O'Connell produced a set of lockpicks he hadn't used since his days as a beat cop in the city. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the shushing sound of the sleet and the frantic beat of his own heart. He worked quickly, his fingers numb with cold and tension. Click. The lock sprang open. They slid the heavy door aside, revealing the dark, yawning mouth of the shaft. A stench, not of ordinary earth and decay, but a chemical, metallic odor wafted up from the depths. It was the same odor O'Connell had first smelled in the Sallie house, now intensified 100-fold. The barium. Vance breathed, immediately pulling a damp handkerchief over his nose and mouth. "We can't go down without proper gear, Thomas. It's too dangerous." "We don't have a choice," O'Connell insisted. "If they clean this out before the state police get here, we have no case. If they find Elias, we have no witness." He had to get the evidence. A small, undeniable sample of the stored poison itself. He secured a thick rope around an old support beam and started the careful, agonizing descent. The wooden ladder rungs were slick with condensation, and the air grew thick and heavy. O'Connell's lungs burned, a sharp, metallic taste filling his mouth. He could feel the systemic effects of the poison already, a faint trembling in his hands, a sudden tightness in his chest. Finally, his feet hit the uneven floor of the first chamber. The beam of his lantern swept across the cavernous space, revealing what they had feared. Stacks of heavy, unmarked metal drums lined the damp walls. They were leaking. A sickly white crystalline powder, the barium compound, was visible on the floor, mixing with the dark, oily runoff. O'Connell knelt, quickly scraping a generous sample of the toxic runoff into a small, sealed evidence jar Vance had provided. As he capped the jar, a faint sound echoed from a deep, branching tunnel further down the shaft. Scraping. A metallic sound, followed by the muffled thud of a tool. Someone else was down there. Herrick, Alderson, or one of their trusted crewmen, completing the final cleanup. O'Connell froze, extinguishing his lantern. He was in the dark, 30 feet below ground, standing in a reservoir of deadly poison, with one of the killers mere yards away. The only light was the thin, cold slit of the opening above him. The metallic stench was overwhelming, forcing shallow, ragged breaths. He scrambled for the rope, his heart pounding a desperate rhythm against the silence. The terror was not of the dark, but of the human evil that surrounded him, ready to seal him in this toxic grave. Thank you for your continued support of the echoes of Ashmore Hill, a Sallie House family tragedy. We are now at the climax of the investigation. The danger has never been higher, and Sheriff O'Connell's life is at risk. If you are captivated by this intense, realistic psychological thriller and want to witness the final explosive confrontation and the fall of the criminal syndicate, please subscribe to the channel right now. Your subscription helps us bring more gripping, high-quality, non-supernatural horror to life. Don't miss the coming chapters. O'Connell pressed himself flat against the cold, damp rock wall, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. The barium was taking its toll. The fine tremor in his muscles was becoming a noticeable shake. He could not afford to make a sound. The metallic scraping grew louder, closer. A flashlight beam flickered around the corner, casting long, monstrous shadows on the cavern wall. It was not one of the suit-wearing architects of the crime, but a huge, burly man in thick mining gear, the muscle, the enforcer. The man, clearly working on the final stage of cleaning out the barrels, paused. His head lifted, straining to hear something in the silence. O'Connell knew his own ragged breathing was likely audible in the dead air. The man took a step toward O'Connell's position, his heavy boots crunching on the loose gravel. O'Connell knew he couldn't outrun him, not in this confined space, not with the poison weakening him. His only chance was a swift, silent move. As the man rounded the corner, his flashlight beam momentarily blinding O'Connell, the sheriff pushed off the wall with a desperate surge of adrenaline. He sidestepped the enforcer's charge and slammed the butt of his revolver into the man's temple. The heavy man grunted, staggered, and dropped his flashlight, which rolled across the floor, its beam spinning wildly before settling on a stack of empty, recently cleaned barrels. The enforcer, clearly stunned, recovered quickly, bellowing a curse as he lunged, grappling for O'Connell's weapon. They wrestled in the dark, the air thick with barium and the metallic taste of fear. The enforcer was stronger, but O'Connell was fueled by the grim certainty of the Sallie family's fate. He fought with a desperate ferocity, fueled by the image of the children's bodies perfectly aligned in the parlor. O'Connell managed to twist free, forcing the man back toward the wall of drums. With a final, explosive effort, he shoved the enforcer directly into a stack of barrels. The impact was deafening. The rusted metal drums gave way with a screech and a crash, spilling the remaining highly concentrated barium sludge across the ground. The enforcer scrambled out of the toxic muck, his hands covered in the white crystalline poison. He coughed violently, the effect of the concentrated poison in the air now immediate and overwhelming. His charge faltered. He clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain and confusion. The exact, terrifying death symptom Arthur Sallie had described, the one that mimics a systemic heart failure. O'Connell, his own chest tight and burning, scrambled back to the rope. His evidence jar clutched tightly. He looked down at the enforcer who collapsed, convulsing into the muck, a final ironic victim of the very poison he was hired to cover up. Vance, who had been anxiously waiting above, helped O'Connell ascend the last few feet. As soon as O'Connell emerged, he collapsed, gasping, into the fresh, cold air. "The sample, Thomas. Did you get it?" Vance demanded, checking O'Connell's pulse. O'Connell nodded, handing over the sealed jar. "The enforcer. He's dead. Barium poisoning. It works fast. They were cleaning up Silas. The cleanup is done." "We have to go now," Vance said, pulling O'Connell to his feet. "If they sent one man, they'll send more." They raced back toward Ashmore Hill, O'Connell's mind clear despite the throbbing in his chest. They had the poison sample. They had the confession. All they needed was the arrival of Elias and the state police. Back in his office, O'Connell swallowed a massive dose of the stomach-settling salts Vance had provided, a crude but necessary countermeasure for the exposure. He was battered, poisoned, and cornered, but he had the proof. The silence of the night was shattered by a loud, insistent rapping on the station door. O'Connell looked up, his hand automatically reaching for his gun. He was expecting the city men. Instead, a young boy stood on the porch, rain-soaked and terrified. Sheriff O'Connell! They got Doc Vance! They dragged him right out of his clinic! The air went cold. Herrick and Alderson had moved their pieces. They had realized O'Connell had found the physical evidence. They had targeted the one person who could scientifically confirm the nature of the poison. Dr. Vance was now their leverage, or their next victim. The confrontation was no longer a waiting game. It had become a brutal rescue mission. O'Connell's world narrowed to a cold, single-minded focus. They had Dr. Vance. They knew O'Connell was the only other threat. He was alone, and he had to assume that the state police, delayed by the weather and the difficulty of the remote journey, were still hours away. He knew where they would be. Herrick and Alderson were men of pride and control. They would not take Vance to some hidden shack. They would take him to the place that represented their victory and their power, the Ashmore Inn. O'Connell loaded his revolver. He took a heavy iron poker from his office fireplace, a solid weapon for close quarters. He also took the jar containing the barium sample. He wasn't just going to rescue Vance, he was going to end the reign of Herrick and Alderson. The Ashmore Inn was dark, quiet, and imposing. O'Connell slipped around the back, finding a kitchen entrance that was unlocked, a common carelessness in a town that rarely had need for security. The interior was silent. He moved like a shadow, taking the back stairs to the second floor, where the most exclusive suites were located. He could hear low, muffled voices coming from the large parlor suite at the end of the hall, the suite of Herrick and Alderson. He positioned himself by the heavy wooden door, his heart hammering in his chest, ignoring the lingering burn of the barium in his system. He could hear Dr. Vance's voice, strained and defiant, followed by the smooth, chilling tones of James Herrick. "You're a brilliant man, Doctor," Herrick was saying. "But your small-town morals are tiresome. Tell us where Sheriff O'Connell hid the confession and the barium sample, and we let you live." "You've killed 4 innocent people, Herrick," Vance spat out. "And your greed has poisoned an entire town. I will tell you nothing." "A regrettable necessity," Alderson's deep voice rumbled. "Arthur Sallie was weak. He was going to expose the whole operation. We simply used his own method against him. A neat, elegant solution to a messy problem. The only loose end is you two." O'Connell took a deep breath, kicked the door hard just above the lock. The wood split with a violent, shattering crack. He burst into the room, his gun leveled. The scene was stark. Dr. Vance was tied to a heavy wooden chair, a trickle of blood on his forehead. Herrick was standing by the fireplace, elegant and composed. Alderson, hulking and menacing, was standing guard. "Sheriff O'Connell," Herrick said, his voice a mocking purr, showing not a flicker of surprise. "We anticipated you might be so dramatically inclined. Predictable. It ends now, Herrick. The barium sample is secured. The confession is out of your reach. You're finished." Alderson moved first, charging with surprising speed. O'Connell knew his limited strength. He didn't engage directly. He aimed his shot not at the man, but at the massive, expensive chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. The shot cracked the air. The heavy metal chain snapped. The chandelier crashed down with a deafening explosion of crystal, metal, and plaster, plunging the room into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the fireplace. Alderson, momentarily stunned by the impact and the sudden darkness, stumbled. O'Connell used the distraction, bringing the iron poker around in a wide, vicious arc. The poker connected with a sickening thud against Alderson's knee. The big man cried out and collapsed, clutching his shattered leg. Herrick, however, was prepared. He hadn't panicked. From his coat pocket, he produced a small silver derringer. He fired. The bullet missed O'Connell's head by inches, burying itself in the plaster wall. O'Connell threw himself to the ground, rolling toward the flickering light of the fireplace. He felt the intense burning pain of the barium exposure flare in his chest. He was running out of time. "You can't win, Sheriff," Herrick shouted, his voice echoing in the ruined room. "We control everything. The evidence is circumstantial." "Not this," O'Connell gasped, scrambling up to his knees. He pulled the jar of barium sludge from his coat. "This is the poison, the proof of murder. And you're going to tell the court how you got it." Herrick, seeing the jar, lunged, his face contorted in a final desperate fury. He knew the sample was the end of him. O'Connell met his lunge, not with a gun, but with the poker. He swung low, knocking Herrick off balance. As Herrick stumbled toward the fireplace, O'Connell brought the poker up in a final, vicious strike, catching Herrick beneath the chin. The elegant architect of the tragedy crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The room fell silent, save for Alderson's labored breathing and the crackle of the fire. O'Connell dropped the poker, his body shaking uncontrollably from exertion and poison. He staggered over to Dr. Vance and quickly cut him free. "They're finished, Silas," O'Connell whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's over." Just then, the sound of horses and shouting could be heard outside. The state police had arrived. Elias had made it. The truth had finally ridden into Ashmore Hill. The morning after the arrests of James Herrick and Vance Alderson was marked by a fragile, exhausted silence in Ashmore Hill. The sleet had stopped, replaced by a cold, clear dawn. The Stonehouse tragedy, which had begun as an inexplicable mystery, was now a solved case of corporate homicide. Herrick and Alderson were being held under maximum security in the county jail, their faces, scratched, bruised, and finally stripped of their arrogance, staring out from behind the bars. The barium sample, the confession, and the testimony of Dr. Vance and Josephine Hayes created an undeniable case of murder and environmental crime. Elias Thorne, who had arrived with a company of state police troopers, was exhausted but triumphant. They're charging them with first-degree murder for the Sallie family, the Hayes, the Miller, and over 20 counts of manslaughter for the workers who died from the poisoning, Elias reported, placing a steaming mug of strong coffee on O'Connell's desk. O'Connell, sitting hunched over, wrapped in a blanket, sipped the coffee slowly. He was still profoundly shaken, not just by the violence, but by the cold, calculated depravity of the men who had planned the entire affair from comfortable city offices. They were so careful, Elias. The dollhouse, the staged positions, it wasn't just to hide the poison, it was a victory dance. They were mocking Arthur Sallie's love for his family, telling him even in death that they controlled every detail of his final, miserable act. Dr. Vance, though physically unharmed, sat quietly beside him, his expression grim. "The poisoning of the water table, Thomas. The extent of the contamination is massive. It will take years to clean up, and many more will get sick. The tragedy of the Sallie house is just the opening chapter of Ashmore Hill's suffering." The victory, O'Connell realized, was hollow. The physical manifestation of the terror, the poison, was now woven into the fabric of the town. The ghosts were the barium in the water, the lingering cough of the workers, and the deep, abiding fear that such evil could operate so cleanly, so close to home. Later that afternoon, O'Connell returned to the Stonehouse with Dr. Vance to supervise the final sealing of the property before the state seized it. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the clamor of forensic teams, documenting every detail of the murder. In the parlor, the dollhouse still sat in the corner. O'Connell knelt beside it. The miniature figures, the Sallie family, were being carefully collected and documented as evidence. "Arthur Sallie brought this upon his own family, Thomas," Vance said quietly, looking at the dolls. "He was the first architect of the crime. His greed sealed their fate." "Yes," O'Connell agreed, standing up, "but greed is just a sin. Herrick and Alderson were the true demons. They didn't just want to take his money. They wanted to take his humanity. They turned his greatest fear, harm coming to his children, into a theatrical punishment." O'Connell picked up a small, hand-stitched piece of fabric that had fallen from Eleanor Sallie's needlepoint hoop on the side table. It was a depiction of the stone house, small and perfect, like the dollhouse. But beneath it, Eleanor had begun stitching a single, ominous black line, a fissure running through the middle of the house. He realized the horror. Eleanor Sallie, in the days before her death, had sensed the deep, underlying rot in her home and her life. Her needlework was a silent, desperate commentary on the impending collapse of her world. The terror had been growing slowly, domestically, before the final, violent execution. The voices that echoed inside the stone house were not spectral moans. They were the desperate, final echoes of a family's secrets, the quiet anxieties of a wife, the silent guilt of a father, and the crushing reality of human wickedness. O'Connell placed the needlework with the rest of the evidence. He had saved the town from the immediate threat, but the dark, indelible mark of the crime, the chemical poison, and the memory of the 4 quiet, perfectly placed bodies would forever linger. He looked out the parlor window at the town of Ashmore Hill, now safe from the immediate danger, but scarred by the truth. The burden of the town's suffering, and the knowledge of how easily evil could flourish under the guise of respectability, was a weight he would carry for the rest of his days. The mystery was solved, but the terror, the raw human terror, had just begun to take root in the heart of Ashmore Hill.